Dear listener, pull your armchair a little closer to the fire and let the kettle sing. In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where gossip travels faster than the post, nothing is ever quite as peaceful as it seems. Tonight join the inimitable Miss Jane Marple, knitting needle in hand, eyes bright as a robin's, as she unravels a puzzle so cunning it might have baffled Scotland Yard itself. Chapter 1. The Locked Door. The village of St. Mary Mead lay cupped in the palm of the downs like a forgotten teacup. China blue skies, willow green meadows, and a church spire that had pointed the same unhurried finger at heaven since the Wars of the Roses. On the morning of Tuesday, the 9th of October, 1951, the postman's bicycle bell tinged twice along the high street. Mrs. Price Ridley's cocker spaniel barked at a perfectly innocent milk float, and the surgery of Dr. James Haydock stood waiting for its first patient with the polite patience of a well-trained butler. The surgery itself was a modest red brick annex tacked onto the doctor's own cottage like an afterthought by a committee that had run out of money. White net curtains fluttered at the windows. A brass plate polished every Tuesday by Mrs. Sims the cleaner caught the pale autumn sun and flung it back in cheerful winks. Beneath the plate, in sober Roman capitals, ran the legend. At 9:05, Nurse Edith Pratt arrived with the punctuality of a Swiss railway. She wore a navy cape that had seen better decades and carried a wicker basket containing the day's instruments wrapped in green baize. She let herself in with her own key, hung her cape on the stand shaped like a stork, and began the ritual of opening up. Windows cracked 2 inches to admit the scent of Michaelmas daisies. The appointments book laid open to the correct date. The brass scales on the dispensary counter given a precautionary flick with a duster. The waiting room smelled of lavender polish and the ghost of wintergreen from last week's liniment. 6 bentwood chairs stood in 2 precise rows, each with a copy of Punch from 1948. Dr. Haydock believed in economy. A notice board offered stern advice about boiled water, the dangers of patent medicines, and the forthcoming meeting of the St. Mary Mead Horticultural Society. Beneath it, a single rubber plant drooped in mute protest at the central heating. At 9:15, the first patient, old Mr. Hugg, who believed his liver was made of India rubber, shuffled in, coughed twice, and was shown into the consulting room. Nurse Pratt closed the door with the soft click of long practice. Through the panel, she could hear the familiar baritone of the doctor. "And how are we today, Mr. Hugg?" Followed by the patient's inevitable reply that he was, "Mustn't grumble, doctor, mustn't grumble." By 10 o'clock, the room had seen Mrs. Clement with her neuralgia, young Tommy Simons with a fishhook in his thumb, and Miss Hartnell, who had come, ostensibly about her blood pressure, but chiefly to report that the new curate's sermons were a little high for low church. Each emerged clutching a prescription slip in Dr. Haydock's neat copper plate. Each nodded to Nurse Pratt. Each departed with the sense that the world for the moment was in competent hands. At 10:30, the doctor himself appeared in the doorway between consulting room and dispensary. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the sort of face that looked as though it had been carved from good English oak and then polished by 40 years of bedside manner. His wing collar was immaculate, his type in a tiny gold caduceus. In his left hand he carried the brown glass bottle that had become as much a part of his persona as the stethoscope around his neck. Haydock's own nerve tonic. A spoonful at noon keeps the nerves in tune. "Edith," he said, "I'll take my 11s in the surgery, if you please. And tell Mrs. Sims not to fuss with the fire. There's a draft from the chimney and I've a letter to finish." Nurse Pratt poured hot water into the Brown Betty teapot, added 2 spoons of tea, the doctor disliked it strong, and carried the tray through. The consulting room was a small, comfortable cave, leather armchair facing the desk, medical diplomas in severe black frames, a glass cabinet of instruments that gleamed like a regiment on parade. On the desk stood the tonic bottle, half full, and beside it the doctor's fountain pen, black enamel, gold nib, a present from his late wife on their silver wedding. The inkwell was dry. The doctor preferred to fill his pen from a bottle kept in the drawer. "Thank you, nurse," he said, not looking up from the letter. "And if Captain Blaine telephones from town, tell him I'm engaged until luncheon." Nurse Pratt withdrew. The door closed. The key turned in the lock, a habit the doctor had acquired during the war when confidential records about evacuees were kept on the premises. Outside, the waiting room was empty. The rubber plant drooped a fraction lower. 11 o'clock chimed from the church tower, mellow and unhurried. Nurse Pratt locked the front door for the mid-morning break, hung the back at 11:45 card in the window, and stepped into the cottage kitchen to boil an egg for her own luncheon. The kitchen overlooked the garden, a square of lawn, a herbaceous border still defiant with dahlias, a gate in the brick wall that opened onto the lane where the butcher's boy left joints wrapped in greaseproof paper. She noticed the gate was ajar. Odd, for the doctor was particular about latches, but the egg timer was ticking and she thought no more of it. At 11:30 the knocker sounded. Nurse Pratt wiped her hands on her apron and opened to find Constable Polk, helmet tucked under his arm, raindrops glittering on his cape like sequins. "Morning, nurse. Message from the station. Dr. Haydock's wanted on the telephone. Urgent, they say. Something about the isolation hospital." Nurse Pratt hesitated. "He's locked himself in to finish correspondence. Said he wasn't to be disturbed." "Try anyway," said Polk. "It's Dr. Lloyd at the other end. Won't take no." Nurse Pratt crossed to the consulting room door and knocked. 3 discreet taps. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Silence. She tried the handle. Locked. "Doctor?" she called, a note of unease creeping in. "Dr. Haydock. Telephone for you." Still nothing. Constable Polk shifted from foot to foot. "Maybe he's stepped into the garden," he suggested. "I'll nip round." He disappeared. Nurse Pratt waited, ears straining. From the lane came the sound of Polk's boots on gravel. Then his voice muffled, "Gates open, footprints in the mud, leading in, not out." A pause. "Nurse, fetch the spare key." The spare key hung on a hook inside the cottage pantry, labeled in the doctor's own hand. Nurse Pratt's fingers fumbled. The key slipped, clattered to the tiles. She snatched it up, ran back, thrust it into the lock. It turned with a reluctant scrape. The door swung inward. Dr. James Haydock sat in his leather chair exactly as he had an hour earlier, except his head had fallen forward, chin on chest, silver hair gleaming like frost. The fountain pen lay uncapped on the blotter, its nib glinting wetly, though the inkwell remained stoppered. The tonic bottle stood beside it, 1/3 full, the glass beside it holding a mouthful of amber liquid. On the carpet, a single drop had soaked into the pattern of the Turkish rug like a tiny dark flower. Nurse Pratt's scream brought Mrs. Sims running from the scullery, flour on her forearms. Constable Polk lumbered in from the garden, helmet now on back to front. Behind them, drawn by the sound as iron filings to a magnet, came Miss Hartnell clutching her district visitor's notebook, young Tommy Simons with his fishhook still bandaged, and Mrs. Price Ridley's cocker spaniel, who barked once and then thought better of it. "Stand back," ordered Polk, though the order was superfluous. No one seemed anxious to approach. He tiptoed forward, touched the doctor's wrist, shook his head. "Cold," he announced as though temperature were a crime. Dr. Lloyd, the locum from Much Benham, arrived 10 minutes later, summoned by a frantic telephone call from the post office. He was a thin young man with a nervous Adam's apple and a tendency to say, "Gosh." He bent over the body, sniffed the glass, recoiled. "Prussic acid," he said. "Hydrocyanic almonds, gosh." He lifted the tonic bottle, held it to the light. "But this is the doctor's own preparation, perfectly harmless. I watched him mix a batch last week. Inspector Slack from Milchester CID arrived at noon, driving so fast that his Austin scattered the ducks on the village pond. He was a large man who believed in fingerprints and disliked amateurs. He strode into the surgery, took one look at the locked door, the key on the mat outside, the body, the bottle, and announced, "Suicide. Case closed. Poor chap must have had worries." Miss Marple arrived at 12:15 bearing a basket of windfall apples for the Patient's Comforts Fund. She was small and white-haired and looked, as Mrs. Bantry often said, like a particularly innocent marshmallow. Her blue eyes, however, were as bright and curious as a robin's. She paused on the threshold, taking in the scene with the quiet thoroughness of a botanist examining a rare bloom. The key on the mat, the open garden gate visible through the side window, the fountain pen with its suspiciously wet nib, the tonic bottle, label facing forward, stopper replaced with precision, the single drop on the rug. "Curious," she murmured so softly that only Nurse Pratt heard. "Most curious." Inspector Slack bore down upon her like a battleship. "Nothing for you here, ma'am. Tragic, but straightforward." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Oh, I quite understand, Inspector. Only I happen to be passing, and Mrs. Sims does so like a Cox's orange pippin for her dumplings." She placed the basket on the waiting room table, adjusted her spectacles, and noted three things. The brass inkwell was dry, yet the pen nib glistened. The appointments book lay open to the correct date, but the page for the 10th was already turned down at the corner. Tomorrow's page, as though someone had been planning ahead. On the blotter, beneath the pen, a faint circle of moisture had dried to a barely visible ring, perfectly round, the size of a sixpence. Outside, the church clock struck the quarter. Somewhere in the garden, a late rose dropped a petal. Miss Marple picked up her basket, thanked Nurse Pratt for the offer of tea, which had not been made, and walked slowly back down the lane, her mind ticking as steadily as her knitting needles. Behind her, the surgery door closed once more. The brass plate caught the sun and flung it back, cheerful, innocent, and entirely unaware that it now presided over a locked-room mystery that would keep St. Mary Mead gossiping until Christmas. Chapter 2. 5 Cups of Tea. In St. Mary Mead, the shortest distance between two facts was a straight line drawn by Mrs. Price Ridley's tongue. By 2 o'clock that same Tuesday, the vicarage drawing-room, ordinarily a sanctuary of seed cake and subdued charity, had become Grand Central Station for rumor. The fire crackled like gossip itself. The kettle on the hob hissed a counterpoint. And 5 ladies, each armed with a teacup and a theory, formed a circle as neat as a pentagram. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, presided at the head of the table. She was a tall woman whose bun had the rigidity of a guardsman's bearskin, and whose charity was legendary, provided it was dispensed at a safe distance. Today her drawing-room smelled of Darjeeling, hot buttered toast, and the faint metallic tang of shock. "Lock the door, Griselda, dear," she instructed her husband, who had wandered in hoping for a sandwich. "We are in committee." The Reverend Leonard Clement retreated with the meekness of a man who had long ago learned that domestic battles were best lost early. The door clicked shut. 5 pairs of eyes turned to the 6th occupant, Miss Jane Marple, seated beside the fireplace in the least comfortable chair, knitting something oatmeal-colored and apparently endless. "Let us be methodical," began Mrs. Clement, producing a notebook bound in tooled morocco. Fact 1. Dr. Haydock found dead at 11:42, give or take. Fact 2. Door locked from within, key on mat outside. Fact 3. Prussic acid suspected, yet his own tonic bottle innocent as a babe's milk. Discuss. Mrs. Price Ridley needed no second invitation. She was a small, round woman whose hats always looked as though they had been designed by a committee of angry fruit. Today's confection involved a stuffed kingfisher and 3 cherries that bobbed like fishing floats whenever she grew excited, which was often. Suicide, she declared, mouth prim. The poor man was in low spirits. I met him on the high street only yesterday, and he looked positively gray. Said he hadn't slept since the Blitz. Rubbish, countered Miss Hartnell, whose own hat resembled a small shrubbery in mourning. James Haydock was the picture of health. He danced the Paul Jones at the Conservative Fete not 3 weeks ago. No, mark my words, foul play. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Dancing is no proof of serenity, Letitia dear. I once knew a man in Torquay who waltzed the night before he drowned himself in the harbor, but do go on. Miss Hartnell needed no encouragement. She leaned forward, voice dropping to the conspiratorial hush reserved for scandals involving clergy or royalty. Captain Blaine, she said. The nephew. Arrived from London yesterday on the 4:30 train, all smiles and crocodile tears. Claims he came to discuss family matters. Ha! The practice is worth 5,000 if it's worth a penny, and the captain's been living on tick since the war. Debts at his club, debts at the tailor's, debts at... She caught herself, remembering the presence of Miss Weatherby, whose nephew was a tailor. Well, debts, Mrs. Clement made a note. Motive, inheritance. Opportunity, unknown. Alibi, claims he was at the Blue Boar from 5 o'clock onward. Alone? Asked Miss Weatherby, a faded gentlewoman who spoke in italics. Reading the Times in the snug. Barmaid confirms. Miss Marple lifted her cup. 4 lumps, please, Agnes. One must keep one's strength up for sleuthing. She accepted the sugar, stirred thoughtfully. Captain Blaine was always a charming boy. I remember him at 12 stealing strawberries from old Mr. Badcock's greenhouse. Said the war had taught him initiative. 1. Wonders what the war taught him about prussic acid. Conversation swirled like steam from the teapot. Nurse Pratt had been seen weeping in the churchyard at dawn. Penance, she called it, but whose sin? Gladys Linnet, Mrs. Bantry's maid, had been flashing a new brooch no maid's wages could buy. Mr. Polk, the chemist, had slammed his shop door so hard the bell rang for a full minute. And Miss Hartnell's own sister, Mrs. Dane Coventry, had taken the London train that very morning for her nerves, though her nerves had survived 2 husbands and a bankruptcy without visible damage. Miss Marple set down her cup. People are like knitting patterns, she said softly. Skip 1 stitch and the whole sleeve goes awry. Let us consider the stitches. She rose, small, neat, unstoppable, and crossed to the window. The vicarage garden sloped gently to the lane. Beyond, the surgery roof was just visible above a hedge of laurel. A thin plume of smoke rose from the cottage chimney. Mrs. Sims was burning papers in the kitchen range, no doubt under police supervision. Edith Pratt was engaged to the doctor once, Miss Marple continued half to herself. In 1938, I believe. He broke it off, said the practice left no room for a wife. She never married. Curious how love curdles into something sharper. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. She threatened him. I heard it myself outside the post office. You'll be sorry, James Haydock, she said. Mark my words. Words are cheap, murmured Miss Marple. Poison, however, is not. At that moment the door burst open and Colonel Bantry strode in, red-faced and tweedier than usual. Griselda, my dear, have you seen my... Good heavens, it's a mother's meeting in here. He caught sight of Miss Marple. Ah, Jane, heard the news. Tragic. Haydock was a good sort. Fixed my gout in 47. Mrs. Bantry followed, plump and placid. Arthur, you promised not to interrupt. Ladies, forgive him. He's been in the gunroom polishing things that don't need polishing. Miss Marple smiled. Dolly, you're Gladys. Was she in the village this morning? Mrs. Bantry blinked. Gladys? Why, yes. Took the dog's meat to the butcher at 9, then went to the chemist for my lavender water. Why? Nothing, nothing. Only I saw her hurrying past the surgery gate at 11:20 with a parcel under her arm. Brown paper string. Looked heavy. Mrs. Clement's pen scratched furiously. Parcel. Chemist. 11:20. Gladys Lynette. Miss Hartnell leaned forward again. And Mr. Polk, our Mr. Polk, has been ordering bulk cyanide. Says it's for killing wasps, but who ever heard of wasps in October? The kingfisher on Mrs. Price Ridley's hat gave a little quiver of agreement. Miss Marple returned to her chair. Let us not leap to conclusions. Cyanide is also used in photography. Captain Blaine fancies himself an amateur photographer, develops his own plates in that dark little room above the garage. I've seen the red lamp glowing at odd hours. Silence fell, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock and the soft click of Miss Marple's needles. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window panes and sent a shower of leaves skittering across the lawn like startled sparrows. Mrs. Clement closed her notebook with a snap. Then we have 5 suspects, each with motive, means, or opportunity. Captain Blaine, money. Nurse Pratt, revenge. Gladys Lynette, theft. Perhaps she was caught pilfering drugs. Mr. Polk, professional rivalry. The doctor was about to report him for diluting calamine, and Mrs. Dane Coventry believed the doctor was courting her sister again, finished Miss Hartnell grimly. She told me so herself. Said she'd put a stop to it if she had to go through him to do it. Miss Marple poured herself another cup. 5 cups of tea, 5 suspects. How very symmetrical. She sipped, eyes bright over the rim. But symmetry is suspicious in itself. Real life is rarely so tidy. The fire settled with a small avalanche of coals. In the garden, the laurel hedge shivered as though someone had passed behind it. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the window, but the path was empty. Mrs. Price Ridley shivered deliciously. Do you think the murderer is still in the village? My dear Agnes, said Miss Marple, in St. Mary Mead, the murderer is always in the village. The question is, which teacup did they drink from? She set her own cup down with delicate precision. The pattern on the saucer was forget-me-nots, tiny blue flowers that looked innocent until you noticed how tenaciously they spread. Chapter 3. The Garden Gate. The afternoon slid toward tea time with the languid grace of a cat stretching in sunlight. St. Mary Mead dozed under a sky the color of skimmed milk. Only the rooks in the elms kept up a desultory conversation, as though debating whether the doctor's death warranted a full caw or merely a croak. In the surgery garden, the Michaelmas daisies had closed their faces against the chill and the last rose of summer. Madame Isaac Pereire, crimson and blousy, dropped a petal onto the path like a bead of blood. Miss Marple had borrowed Mrs. Bantry's secateurs on the pretext of pruning rosemary for the church bazaar. The secateurs were bright and sharp and entirely unnecessary. The rosemary had been trimmed the previous Thursday by the gardener's boy. But Mrs. Bantry, who believed in the therapeutic value of gossip more than fresh air, had handed them over with a conspiratorial wink. Mind you don't cut yourself, Jane dear. And if you happen to notice anything interesting by the garden gate— Miss Marple's smile was as bland as rice pudding. One never knows what the rosemary may reveal, Dolly. She let herself out through the side door of Danemead, crossed the lane where the butcher's van had left its usual archipelago of muddy islands, and slipped through the surgery's back gate. The latch lifted with a small, guilty click. The garden lay quiet, almost expectant. A robin scolded from the apple tree. Somewhere a clock struck the quarter. 4:15. The path was gravel, recently raked. Footprints showed clearly. 2 sets, the heavy tread of Constable Polk's regulation boots and a lighter, narrower print, ladies' court shoes, size 5, heels slightly run over on the outside. Miss Marple bent, joints creaking like old floorboards, and noted the direction, in toward the surgery, out toward the lane. The outward print carried a faint smear of mud on the left toe, mud the color of the lane, not the garden. She straightened, secateurs dangling, and surveyed the border. The dahlias stood in soldierly rows, labels fluttering. Bishop of Llandaff, Gary Hoke, Edinburgh. Between the third and fourth plant, a gap. The soil was disturbed, a clod turned over. Miss Marple knelt again, parted the leaves with the secateurs, and uncovered a small brown glass bottle, stoppered, half buried. The label was torn, but the word tonic was legible. She did not touch it. Instead, she marked the spot with a twig and moved on. The garden gate, green-painted iron 5-barred, opened onto the lane at the rear. A milk bottle stood on the step, 3/4 full, cream thick at the neck. Beside it, a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The label, in Gladys Lynnett's round schoolgirl hand, read, Mr. Polk, chemist, with care. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose a fraction. Gladys had passed this way not 20 minutes earlier. She had seen the girl herself hurrying toward the high street, cheeks pink, parcel clutched like contraband. Miss Marple lifted the parcel, light, no rattle, and set it gently back. The string was new, the knot a clumsy granny. She noted the postmark on the paper, St. Mary Mead, 9 Oct 1951. Yesterday's date. Curiouser and curiouser, a footstep on the gravel behind her. She turned to find Nurse Pratt, cape flapping like a wounded crow, eyes red-rimmed. Miss Marple, whatever are you doing? The police said the garden was out of bounds. I was pruning rosemary, said Miss Marple mildly, holding up the secateurs as evidence. Mrs. Bantry's plant is encroaching on the doctor's border. One must keep the peace between neighbors, even in death. Nurse Pratt's mouth opened, closed. The police took the key. You shouldn't be here. Yet here we both are, observed Miss Marple. Tell me, Edith, when you locked the surgery door this morning, did you notice whether the garden gate was latched? I can't recall. The shock, you know. Nurse Pratt's fingers worried at the clasp of her handbag. I boiled an egg. I never thought, of course not. Shock plays tricks. I once knew a woman in Bournemouth who forgot her own name for a week after her budgerigar escaped. Quite understandable. Nurse Pratt managed a watery smile. You're very kind, Miss Marple, but I must get back. Mrs. Sims is burning papers and the inspector wants the appointments book. She hurried away, cape billowing. Miss Marple watched until she disappeared around the corner of the cottage, then turned back to the gate. The milk bottle caught her eye again. She lifted it carefully. Beneath, pressed into the damp earth, was the perfect imprint of a man's shoe, narrow, pointed, expensive. London, not local. Size 9, perhaps 10. The tread showed a distinctive V-shaped wear on the left heel. Miss Marple committed it to memory, replaced the bottle exactly, and moved along the path to the surgery's side door. It was locked, but the window beside it stood ajar 2 inches, the same 2 inches Nurse Pratt opened every morning. She peered in. The consulting room looked smaller from this angle, almost claustrophobic. The leather chair faced away. The desk was a clutter of papers, the tonic bottle, the fountain pen. On the blotter, the circle of moisture she had noticed earlier had dried to a faint, perfect ring. She was about to withdraw when a movement in the lane caught her eye. Gladys Linnett, apron flapping, darted past the gate, glanced over her shoulder, and vanished toward the village. Miss Marple stepped back into the shadow of the laurel. 5 minutes later, she was in the cottage kitchen, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Sims, who was pink-cheeked from the range and indignation. Burning his private letters, that's what they've got me doing, Mrs. Sims confided, lowering her voice, though the kitchen was empty. Love letters, some of them. From a lady in London. Not that I read them, mind. Of course not, said Miss Marple. "Only the addresses." Mrs. Sims blushed. "Well, one was from a Mrs. Dane Coventry and another from a Captain R. Blaine, though that was more in the way of business, all about shares and such." Miss Marple sipped her tea. It was strong enough to stand a spoon in. "And the tonic bottle, the one from the desk, has it been tested?" Inspector Slack took it himself, said it was clean as a whistle. But there was another bottle, miss, smashed to smithereens in the dustbin. I swept up the pieces myself. "Brown glass, same label." Miss Marple set her cup down. "Brown glass is easily come by. Tell me, Mrs. Sims, did the doctor ever mention a second fountain pen? He was particular about his writing instruments." Mrs. Sims frowned. "Now you mention it, he did have two. Identical, black enamel, gold nibs. One he kept on the desk, the other in his waistcoat pocket for house calls. Said one was for signing death certificates, the other for love letters. Joking, of course." "Of course," echoed Miss Marple. She finished her tea, thanked Mrs. Sims, and stepped back into the garden. Dusk was gathering. The rooks had settled into silence. She retrieved the buried bottle with a handkerchief, wrapped it carefully, and tucked it into her handbag beside the secateurs. The parcel she left where it lay. As she latched the gate behind her, the church clock struck 5. Somewhere in the village a train whistle sounded, the 5:07 to Milchester, carrying Inspector Slack and his evidence back to headquarters. Miss Marple walked slowly home, mind ticking like her grandmother's clock. That evening she invited Nurse Pratt for cocoa. The nurse arrived at 7 sharp, still in her cape, eyes swollen. "You were engaged to the doctor once, weren't you?" Miss Marple asked gently, pouring cocoa thick as velvet. "Ancient history," snapped Nurse Pratt, but her cup rattled in its saucer. "He said the practice came first. I was foolish to believe otherwise." "And the parcel Gladys carried, did you see it?" Nurse Pratt hesitated. "Brown paper, from the chemist. She said it was lavender water for Mrs. Bantry. But I smelled almonds when she passed me in the lane. Photographic cyanide smells of almonds, doesn't it?" Miss Marple stirred her cocoa. "It does indeed. Tell me, Edith, when you locked the surgery door, was the key on the inside or the outside?" "Inside," said Nurse Pratt promptly. "He always locked it from within when he wanted privacy. The spare was in the pantry." Miss Marple nodded. "And the garden gate?" I can't be sure. But the milkman leaves the bottle at the back door every morning. If the gate was latched, he'd have rung the bell." Miss Marple smiled. "Thank you, my dear, you've been most helpful." After Nurse Pratt left, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting needles flying. The pattern was emerging. A locked door, a buried bottle, a parcel, a footprint, a circle on the blotter. 5 stitches in a sleeve that was beginning to look suspiciously like murder. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows like a warning. Miss Marple knitted on, secure in the knowledge that in St. Mary Mead no gate, garden or otherwise, was ever truly latched against the truth. Chapter 4. The Red Herring. Wednesday dawned blustery, the kind of wind that snatches hats and secrets with equal glee. By 9 o'clock, Constable Paulk had arrested Gladys Linnet outside the post office, the brown paper parcel clutched like a guilty conscience. The charge, suspicion of murder. The evidence, 1 parcel labeled potassium cyanide for photographic use, and a new brooch no maid could afford. St. Mary Mead exhaled in collective relief. Case closed, back to jam making. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. She arrived at the police station bearing a paper bag of scones still warm from her oven, butter melting into the crevices like golden gossip. "Constable Paulk," she said sweetly, "might I have a word with the prisoner? Purely in the interests of Christian charity." Paulk, whose weakness for currant scones was legendary, ushered her into the tiny interview room. Gladys sat on a hard chair, apron twisted in, her lap, eyes red as holly berries. "Now, Gladys," began Miss Marple, offering a scone, "tell me about the parcel." Gladys sniffed. "It's for Captain Blaine, miss. He promised to pay me 5 shillings to fetch cyanide from Mr. Polk for developing photographs of Mrs. Bantry's roses. Said he'd enter 'em in the county show." "And the brooch?" "Pawn ticket inside the lining of me coat, miss. Needed the cash for me mum's rent. The brooch belongs to Mrs. Dane Coventry. Found it in the guest room after she left for London. Meant to return it, swear on me Nan's grave." Miss Marple patted the girl's hand. "And were you in the surgery garden yesterday?" "Only to leave the parcel by the gate like the captain said. Never went inside, miss. Door was locked." "Released on lack of evidence?" Inspector Slack muttering about wasted petrol. Gladys fled to her mother's cottage in Much Benham, parcel confiscated, reputation in tatters. Miss Marple returned to the surgery garden at twilight. The police had gone. Only a single constable stood guard at the front, yawning over the dog fancier. She slipped through the side gate unobserved. The buried bottle was gone, unearthed by Slack's men, no doubt. But the circle on the blotter remained, faint as a ghost. She entered the consulting room with the spare key borrowed from Mrs. Sims. "For the patient's comforts fund," she had said. The desk was tidier now, papers stacked, tonic bottle sealed in an evidence bag. The fountain pen lay where it had fallen, nib still glistening faintly, though the inkwell was dry. Miss Marple unscrewed the barrel. Inside, the reservoir was empty, yet the nib wept a single drop when she tilted it. She sniffed. Bitter almonds. She capped the pen, slipped it into her handbag beside the secateurs, and left as quietly as she had come. Outside, the wind had dropped. The garden lay hushed. A late rose nodded approval. Miss Marple walked home through the dusk, mind knitting faster than her fingers ever could. Gladys was a red herring smelling strongly of the sea. The real fish was still swimming, and it had London shoes. Chapter 5. The Chemist's Ledger. Thursday brought frost on the pump and frostier tempers in the high street. Mr. Polk's shop, Polk & Son, dispensing chemists since 1887, opened at 9 sharp, bell jingling like an accusation. Inside, the air was thick with camphor, peppermint, and the faint, sweet rot of secrets. Miss Marple entered at 1:30, basket over her arm, a prescription for lavender water in her gloved hand. Mr. Polk, tall and stooping, with a mustache like a tired walrus, greeted her with professional gloom. "Tragic business, Miss Marple. The doctor was a valued customer." "Indeed," she agreed, "though I believe he mixed his own tonic latterly. May I see the ledger, purely to settle Mrs. Bantry's account?" Polk hesitated, then produced the great red book. Miss Marple turned pages with the delicacy of a pianist, entries in violet ink, 9th oct, 1 dose, empty 4 Oz bottles returned, 8th oct, 12 Oz, Haydock's tonic base, 7th oct, 1 Oz, oil of bitter almonds, for flavoring. She paused at the last. "Photographic cyanide also smells of almonds, does it not?" Polk's left hand trembled. Nicotine stains shaped a perfect pen grip. "For killing wasps," he muttered. "Yet the wasps are gone till spring." Miss Marple closed the ledger. "And 12 empty bottles returned the day before the murder, yet only 11 stood on the shelf when the police arrived. Curious." She purchased her lavender water, thanked him, and stepped into the sunlight. Behind her, the bell jingled once, then stopped, as though the shop itself held its breath. That afternoon, she visited the surgery again. The second fountain pen, the one from the doctor's waistcoat, lay in an evidence envelope on the desk. Identical to the first, save for a tiny scratch on the clip. She held it to the light. The reservoir was full of ink. She unscrewed the nib. Clean. She replaced it exactly. Outside, frost glittered on the dahlias like sugar on a funeral cake. Miss Marple walked home, the ledger's numbers dancing in her head like mischievous imps. 12 bottles minus 11 equals one hidden hand, and a chemist's tremor was a stitch worth pulling. Chapter 6. The Sisters' Alibi. Friday's train from London pulled in at 12:47 precisely, exhaling steam like a satisfied dragon. Mrs. Dane Coventry stepped down in a cloud of Parisian perfume and righteous indignation, hat boxes swinging from gloved fingers. She was a handsome woman of 50-something with the kind of bone structure that made lesser mortals reach for their powder compacts. Miss Marple met her on the platform, ostensibly to collect a parcel of wool for the Red Cross. In truth, she wanted to watch the widow's eyes. "Clarissa, my dear," she greeted. "Such a mercy you're safe. The village is quite upside down." Mrs. Dane Coventry kissed the air an inch from Miss Marple's cheek. "Upside down? I should say so. My sister Hartnell telephoned in hysterics. Said James had been murdered. Preposterous. The man had a weak heart." They walked together toward the station gate. Miss Marple noted the ticket stub protruding from the lady's handbag. "Paddington to St. Mary Mead, 10:15 a.m. departure. Arrived 12:47, solid as Gibraltar." "Yet you left yesterday," Miss Marple murmured. "For your nerves." "Exactly. The doctor prescribed rest. I obeyed." Mrs. Dane Coventry's laugh tinkled like ice in a glass. "He was lending me money, you know. £500. Said it was an investment in my peace of mind. No scandal there." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the porter's clock. "The 10:15 is the down train. You arrived on the up." Mrs. Dane Coventry faltered. "Did I? How silly. I meant the 11:15 connection from town. One loses track." They reached the taxi. Rank. Miss Marple paused. "Tell me, Clarissa, did James ever mention a second fountain pen? He was particular about nibs." "Pens? Good heavens, no. Though he was always fiddling with them, said one wrote smoother than the other. For prescriptions versus love letters, he joked." Miss Marple smiled. "Love letters are slippery things. One must choose the right nib." She watched the taxi bear Mrs. Dane Coventry away, then turned back to the ticket office. The clerk, young Mr. Finch, confirmed. "No 11:15 from Paddington yesterday. The 10:15 was the only direct. Arrival 12:47, departure from London 10:15 sharp." Miss Marple bought a platform ticket for appearance's sake and lingered by the timetable. A porter swept past, whistling. On the ground lay a discarded return stub. St. Mary Mead to Paddington 9 Oct, 8:17 a.m. The ink was fresh, the perforation crisp. Someone had come down early and gone up late. She pocketed the stub. Alibis, like trains, sometimes ran on the wrong track. And a smooth-writing pen could sign more than prescriptions. Chapter 7. The Hollow Nib. Saturday settled over St. Mary Mead like a quilt, thick, comforting, and stitched with invisible seams. In the sitting room of Dane Mead Cottage, Miss Marple sat alone, firelight flickering across the knitting in her lap. On the table before her lay the evidence she had quietly gathered. The fountain pen from the desk, now cleaned by police. Its twin from the waistcoat pocket. The dried circle of blotting paper, the train stub, and wrapped in tissue, the buried bottle from the dahlia bed. She unscrewed the desk pen. The barrel was ordinary, the reservoir empty. She held the nib to the lamp. A hair-fine tube ran through the gold, no wider than a darning needle. She filled a medicine glass with water, pressed the nib against blotting paper. A perfect circle spread, yet the reservoir stayed full. Capillary action. One squeeze, one drop, one death. She telephoned Inspector Slack at Milchester. "Test the nib for cyanide residue," she said calmly. "And search the dustbin again for a second smashed bottle. Brown glass, same label." Slack grunted. Amateur enthusiasm, Miss Marple, but I'll humor you. By tea time, the results were in. Nib, positive for prussic acid. Dustbin. Shards of a second tonic bottle. Traces of cyanide in the glaze. Label. Batch 91051. Only one bottle from that batch was missing from Paulk's dozen. Miss Marple poured tea, added one lump, and considered the train stub. 8:17 a.m. arrival. Captain Blaine had lied about his time. She rang the Blue Boar. The barmaid remembered. Captain came in at 12:05, ordered a whiskey, said he'd walked from the station, but the 11:55 doesn't get in till 12:03. She hung up, needles clicking. The sleeve was nearly finished. One more stitch, then the reveal. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room Denouement. Monday at 4 o'clock, the vicarage drawing room was packed tighter than a church. Fate. Fire crackling, lamps glowing, every chair occupied. Mrs. Clement had laid on seed cake and 2 kinds of sandwich. The air smelled of Earl Grey and expectation. The 5 suspects sat in a semicircle like players on a stage. Captain Blaine, handcuffs discreetly hidden beneath a traveling rug, Nurse Pratt, Mr. Paulk, Mrs. Dane Coventry, and, unexpectedly, Gladys Linnet, summoned back from Much Benham with her mother's best hat. Inspector Slack stood by the mantel, arms folded. Miss Marple, small and white-haired, took the center rug, knitting needles glinting like rapiers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, voice soft but carrying to the back row, "we are here to witness a small experiment." She placed an orange on the occasional table, beside it the fountain pen from the desk, cleaned but the nib still faintly stained. A medicine dropper lay ready. "Prussic acid kills in minutes," she continued. Yet the tonic bottle on the desk was harmless. The poison was delivered through the pen, via a hollow nib acting as syringe. Watch. She filled the dropper with water-tinted blue, inserted it into the pen's reservoir, and pressed the nib against the orange. A perfect circle of blue spread beneath the skin. The reservoir remained full. Gasps rippled. Captain Blaine went the color of putty. Captain Blaine arrived on the 8:17 train, Miss Marple said. Entered by the garden gate at 11:25, the doctor was alive. Refused to sign a forged codicil. Blaine pricked his uncle's hand under pretext of taking pulse, squeezed the nib, then swapped the poison bottle for a fresh one from the shelf. The original he smashed in the dustbin. But he used the wrong pen to forge the codicil. Ink matches the waistcoat pen, not the desk one. The police tested the clean nib first. She produced the waistcoat pen. This one wrote the forgery. The desk pen delivered death. Blaine surged to his feet. "Lies! Constable Paulk tripped him with an umbrella. The captain measured his length on the hearthrug. Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Debt, Captain, is a harsh taskmaster. You needed the practice. Nurse Pratt was the true heir." Nurse Pratt burst into tears, relief, not grief. Mr. Paulk's mustache drooped. Mrs. Dane Coventry adjusted her hat with dignity. Gladys clutched her mother's hand. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "Case closed, Miss Marple, my compliments." The fire settled with a satisfied sigh. Outside, the church clock struck 5. Truth, like tea, was best served promptly. Chapter 10. Tea and Victoria Sponge. Wednesday brought the first real frost, a silver lace across the lawns of St. Mary Mead. At 10:30, Miss Marple presided over morning tea at Dane Mead Cottage as though nothing more dramatic than a misplaced library book had occurred. The fire crackled. The kettle sang. A Victoria Sponge, Mrs. Simms's finest, filled with raspberry jam and cream thick enough to stand a spoon in, sat, enthroned on the 3-tiered stand. Mrs. Bantry arrived first, cheeks pink from the cold. "Jane, you're a marvel. The whole village is buzzing like a hive of bees. Captain Blaine in the dock. Fancy." Mrs. Clement followed, notebook tucked under her arm like a hymnal. I've taken minutes, Miss Marple, for the parish magazine. Mystery solved by local sleuth. Does that sound too sensational? Miss Marple poured tea with the calm of a bishop at benediction. One lump or two, Griselda? And no, dear, truth is never sensational. Only gossip is. Mrs. Price Ridley bustled in, kingfisher hat replaced by a more subdued pheasant feather. Will he hang? She asked with relish, reaching for a sandwich. Transportation, more likely, said Miss Marple. One must be modern. The judge is a nephew of old Lady Chittingham. He believes in reform. Nurse Pratt entered shyly, still in her navy cape but with a new brooch. Pearl, modest, a gift from the grateful village. The practice is mine now, she said, voice trembling. Dr. Lloyd will stay on as partner. I never wanted James dead, only respected. Gladys Linnet slipped in last, apron starched, eyes bright. She carried a small parcel. The brooch, miss, she whispered to Mrs. Dane Coventry, who accepted it with a gracious nod and a murmured apology for the misunderstanding. Mr. Polk hovered in the doorway, mustache freshly waxed. I've promised the bench never to dilute calamine again, he announced, and I've ordered proper photographic cyanide, labeled, locked, and logged. Miss Marple lifted her cup. To village life, where the most poisonous thing is usually the gossip. Laughter rippled like sunlight on water. Outside, the surgery reopened under a new brass plate. Haydock and Pratt, physicians and surgeons. Dr. Lloyd left his fountain pen strictly for writing prescriptions. Gladys returned to Mrs. Bantry's kitchen with a rise in wages and a caution against parcels. Nurse Pratt forgave an old slight and planted rosemary by the garden gate for remembrance. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The oatmeal sleeve was finished. She cast off with a satisfied snip. Another pattern complete, another truth quietly unpicked. As the church clock struck 11, the ladies departed, hats bobbing, voices lowered to a respectful murmur. Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the lane settle back into its accustomed peace. A robin landed on the gatepost, cocked its head, and flew off with a crumb of sponge. She smiled. In St. Mary Mead, mysteries were like roses, prickly, fragrant, and best enjoyed with tea.